Welcome to the Omnibus Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, State Representative from District 23B in southern Minnesota. This week, I dive deep into two bills. Senate File 192, which passed the House and Senate and will become law. It's big government picking winners and losers, socializing all unemployment costs in 2020, whether or not they were COVID-related. On House File 278, which is authored by green energy science deniers Jamie Long and Nick Frentz, I talk about this bill that shifts 100% of our carbon emissions to impoverished nations who use slave labor to mine, manufacture the products that we put on display in cornfields here in Minnesota. I also talk with Reps Tim Miller and Steve Draz about House Resolution 1, which passed the House to shame legislators who advocate for election integrity. I also sit down with radio show host Al Travis, who's one of the latest casualties of today's cancel culture. And on this week's segment of Legisplaining, Draz and I detail how committee chairs are chosen and why lobbyists and special interest groups line up at the trough of government to feed at your expense. Thank you so much for listening to the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. Okay, I'm here with Representatives Steve Draz and Representative Tim Miller, and we want to recap what just happened on the House floor today when the Democrats brought forward House Resolution number 1, which really condemns anybody that's speaking out against election integrity. So,
which is what we're doing.
Yeah, which is what we do all the time when we talk about how we didn't follow election law in this state.
That's what I spoke about at the rally, is the fact that we had the Secretary of State, Democracy Docket, which is a Democrat front group that came here back in the summer, and a liberal judge who was appointed by Mark Dayton and was Amy Klobuchar's past state political director, all in a triad changing election rules here in Minnesota. So that's what I talked about at the rally. I talked about that and actually some fraud that happened back during the primary in Minnesota. And we were talking on the floor as we brought forward an amendment today to this resolution about actually incorporating the need for freedom of speech, because those of us that spoke at the rally on January 6th were roundly condemned by the Speaker and the Majority Leader of the House, and they jumped to conclusions and inflammatory language that landed a sullying of all of our reputations in the media. And so a lot of what we were calling for is an end to that and some responsibility in our rhetoric, and especially responsibility from our leadership.
Yeah. Right. And, for me, the biggest thing that came out of today was, we had the Mankato Free Press, the KEYC, the Fox and CBS affiliates. They ran headlines saying that the House is investigating Munson and Ackland and 4 other reps, and you called out Winkler on the floor to get him to admit that was a lie, that was untrue.
Is there an investigation going on that the House is conducting about anybody who was at the rally on January 6th?
Representative Winkler.
Madam Speaker, Representative Drazkowski, though that is not the subject of the debate before the body right now, the answer to your question is no. I am not aware of anybody of the Minnesota House of Representatives conducting an investigation related to that rally.
But here we have a news article from the Mankato Free Press. House to investigate Ackland Munson over state capitol rally. Quoted in the article, our leadership said, we're investigating whether there were members of the Minnesota House of Representatives who advocated for, incited, or supported acts of domestic terrorism. Majority Leader Winkler, given the fact that we agree there's no investigation happening, there hasn't been any investigation happening, and I'd ask you to yield again another question, but I assume the answer is the same. There's not any investigation planned around the January 6th rally. Is this article inaccurate?
Madam Speaker, Representative Drazkowski, as I said, I haven't actually seen the headline. The statement that you just made, purporting to be a headline, sounds as if that would be inaccurate, but I haven't read the article, so it's very difficult to provide that context.
Yeah, and he did. I had several questions, and he admitted that it wasn't true. There were no investigations going on. The House didn't have any. They didn't have any plan. There wasn't any in the future, and there wasn't any currently. So very clear that what was printed in the Mankato Free Press and other papers was false, and how they got that information or how they came to that conclusion, taking that actually from the speaker and the majority leader, because they're the ones that said it to begin with, and definitely not true.
I like to let people kind of behind the curtain of process. I think it helps people understand, now, what's a House resolution? And really all it is a statement of fact that the House stands behind. It is very rare for us to have a House resolution that's voted on. It's even rarer to have a House resolution that's voted on that would be considered controversial. Typically, it's just a memorial, a statement of fact, but they came out with this gotcha that they were trying to press upon us, and they gave you an unholy decision. You vote yes, and you are condemning people that question the election, which is a far number of people in my district. You vote no, the way that it was written, you look like you condone violence, which certainly no one believes that. But they came forward with this to really try and bully people. I had said on the floor, this resolution is really putting free speech on trial, because they are saying with this, and it did pass, and there were Republicans that voted for it, and it passed, and they were basically saying you cannot say what you think on things that concern you about government. It was a very dangerous precedent to go down, and I'm hoping that we can never do anything like this again.
You guys, they are chilling speech. They are attempting to criminalize political speech that they don't agree with, and that is dangerous.
Yeah, in one of the resolutions at the end here, it says, "Be it further resolved that the House of Representatives of the state of Minnesota stands behind the will of Minnesota voters and supports the full certification of its electoral college votes by the United States Congress." So if you're a congressperson, we have 2 of them in Minnesota that voted no to certify the results.
You're condemning them.
You're condemning them. And I'd say probably a third of the Republicans at least live in CD1 or CD7. So it was just a terrible vote to force people to take. And I think there were several Republicans that just didn't vote at all. I was one of them.
Myself as well.
And Miller, you were too. And Draz, you voted no, along with 7 other Republicans. And then most Republicans and all Democrats voted yes.
So we have a resolution, and the debate needs to continue. We need to continue to talk about election fraud and election integrity in our state. We need to talk about living within the means of the Constitution. That means the executive branch and the judicial branch don't overrule the laws written by the legislative branch. That's what happened here. That's the unconstitutional part. That's the unlawful part of our elections that happened in the state of Minnesota.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, thanks, Draz, for bringing the motion for the amendment forward. And all you guys, thanks for a great debate today.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
I'm going to play for you the floor speech that I gave to House Resolution 1 following Drazkowski, or at least a snippet of what I said, because it's really important. This is a nationwide coordinated effort between the Democrats and the mainstream media to shame legislators who are speaking about election integrity, because we have a very important election coming up next year where typically the minority party will come back strong, because most Americans do want a balance of power. They don't want one party to rule everything because of how quickly they can usher through legislation that can be damaging to our country. So here's the floor speech that I gave and my reasons why I did not vote on House Resolution 1, and I instead supported the resolution brought forward by Representative Drazkowski, which appropriately shamed and condemned the violence that occurred in D.C. while also recognizing the importance of freedom of speech. While the basis for the underlying resolution of H.R. 1 may seem well-intentioned, for those watching from home, we've seen votes just like this one be used for an entirely different political purpose by twisting a legislator's vote on vague language. Now, here it's going to be used by the media and activist groups to condemn or silence debate on this very important issue of elections. Now, we've all sent press releases to the media condemning the violence which occurred in our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. And this resolution that we're amending does not add to our condemnation. However, House Resolution 1 doesn't just condemn violence in D.C., but on line 2.6, It condemns violence directed at our state capitals, which includes St. Paul, where many of your constituents came to peacefully and lawfully petition their government for redress of grievances. There was no violence. There was nothing unlawful. Now, laid out in simple language on lines 1.21 to 1.22 of the underlying resolution is a uniform condemnation of any legislator or public official who speaks about the need to restore election integrity. It says, whereas public officials around the nation have made troubling statements that led to Americans questioning the legitimacy of the 2020 election. Now, Representative Winkler is handy with a dictionary. I looked up what legitimate means. It means conforming to the law or to rules. So it is a fact that the Secretary of State did not follow election laws during the 2020 election. The resolution continues by stating, whereas efforts to thwart the will of Minnesota voters are undemocratic. Now, if we're talking about the Secretary of State going against election laws that were enacted by the House, the Senate, and signed into law by our governor, even to address COVID, then yes, I would agree. His actions to thwart the will of the Minnesota voters were undemocratic. But my guess is that this vague language of the underlying resolution is going to be weaponized by the media to attack those advocating for election integrity. Now, leadership of the House of Representatives, as Representative Draz said, has either intentionally or accidentally spread lies about to damage the reputations of members of this body. In the Mankato Free Press, as Representative Draz said, in my local Fox and CBS affiliates, along with numerous other local papers, ran repeated stories about the Minnesota House launching an investigation of 6 members of the legislature. And there was, in fact, as Representative Winkler, the majority leader, said, no investigation. And the House does not investigate matters such as this. So this lie about a House investigation that the media ran after violent and criminal acts occurred at our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., 1,105 miles away, has fueled this false information laced in the headlines across our state. Now, we have legislators who are now afraid to speak with their constituents for fear of what might be said by their constituents or others who come to the Capitol. Now, we have rallies here all the time, especially when we don't have COVID, where you may go out and speak to a group of people to express your opinion or hear from them, listen to them, talk with them. And you shouldn't be held accountable to what is said after you leave. Now, people have a constitutional right to petition their government for a redress of grievances. You know, there's a reason that the trust in our mass media has plummeted to 41% because lies are fed to them or they print lies. Now, Trey Muse, the reporter who authored the article that Representative Draz spoke of has a headline that says House to investigate Ackland and Munson over state capitol rally. The reporter said that the Free Press editor, because I've reached out to him, Representative Winkler, multiple times. The Free Press editor, Joe Spears, said he won't issue a correction or retraction to the headlines unless he, quote, had reason to believe it was a lie before it was printed, unquote. Now, this, even as many letters to the editor have asked that the misinformation not be spread. The editor, Joe Spear, and reporter Trey Muse have 3 times refused to retract a lie in their headline. And this headline is the first article to appear in a Google search when you search for a freshman member of this House. It sullies the reputation of a new member of the legislature, and we can't control what the media prints. They have the First Amendment, but the leadership of this House has a duty to correct a lie that's continuing to be spread by the media. Now, I support Representative Drazkowski's amendment to H.R. 1, and I believe that this appropriately addresses the violent actions which occurred in D.C. while also supporting freedom to speak. Freedom of speech here is on trial with this resolution.
On this week's episode of Legisplaining, I wanted to dive into how committee chairs are chosen and the impact it has on legislation coming forward. So I'm sitting down with Representative Steve Drazkowski, who's been here at the legislature for 13 years?
13 and a half, something like that, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And so you'd be a great person to ask. When I came up here, I really questioned why we don't have the doctor be the chair of Health and Human Services, why we don't have the contractor, the guy that runs the construction company that has all the experience in housing, be the chair of housing, because they would be, have so much knowledge about this. And instead, we find out that the speaker appoints the chairs of all the committees. Why is that?
And it's been that way since I've been here, Jeremy. When in my earlier years in the legislature, a lot of it was based on seniority. And there was kind of a standing seniority pecking order, both when the Republicans were in control and when the Democrats were in control. And that largely is what determined it. And usually the speaker-elect at that point made those decisions or those appointments based on that. Some of that has changed, though, and we've actually seen since where sometimes committee chairs are chosen based on political favors or based on you supporting me for speaker. Then I'll grant you or I'll promise you this particular committee chair. Traditionally, though, it's been seniority and it's been on the amount of time and interest that you've had in that committee. So if you've served on that committee a long time, it was very likely that you would have a shot at chair of that particular committee. But this year, a lot of it was thrown out the window. The speaker appointed a lot of committee chairs who hadn't been chairs before and maybe hadn't been chairs or hadn't even been members of those committees. So some younger people. I don't know which is the right approach. Certainly, I think you want somebody in a chair with some continuity so that they understand the institution. But certainly, that's the politic part of it and pay for play. You elect me speaker and you'll be a chair. It should be very troubling for people, and I think that did happen again this time.
Well, what I found interesting in my first year up here was that the committee chairs are chosen by the speaker. So the speaker hands out the gavels for the committee, and the speaker can then take a gavel away if that person isn't behaving. In a lot of the power, because the speaker controls who the committee chairs are, the lobbyists go to the speaker and say, I want this bill to get through. I want your Health and Human Services person to roll this into their omnibus bill. Nobody's going to have to vote on my individual bill, but it'll get crammed through. And if it, and then they make donations to, the campaign committees that support the majority or the minority, or I guess it'd be the majority. So the speaker really can control which legislation gets through. And then more frequently, lobbyists will go to the speaker and say, I want this legislation blocked. Hear the bill, lay it over for possible inclusion in the committee's omnibus bill, and then let it disappear.
And depending on the speaker, you may have a speaker who actually respects the efforts of the chair in their committee and actually moves their legislation through, or one who is very engaged politically, certainly with the swamp and the lobbyists, which is very scary, I think, for the voters of Minnesota. It's very real here. The pressure of the swamp and the lobbyists that you pointed out is very real on the speaker. And it takes a lot of courage among the speaker to actually respect his or her members. Another thing they can do, and you started to mention it, is use that committee chair or that gavel, if you're a chair, because I have been a chair in the past, to use that as a stick on you. And if you don't support our agenda and this, this 5% budget increase that we're going to want you to vote on or vote for, I'll take your gavel away. That's the threat that they put in you in the front right at the very beginning of session, or can do. And so I've seen that in the past as well.
Yeah, and I've thought about a solution to fixing this problem, to empower your legislators as opposed to empowering the central, management of the House, and that still allow all the committee chairs to be voted on by the legislators. So maybe you have a freshman or somebody that's been up here 3 years who's a doctor and wants to serve as the chair of Health and Human Services policy. Let them run a campaign among the elected members up here, and they can vote who they want to be the chair of the committee, as opposed to being appointed by the speaker.
Right. Another area of interface there is the staff. So you've got these committee administrators on each committee, and the staff in the Minnesota House has, in the last decade or decade and a half, become more of a situation where all the staff is centralized and the caucus leader, the speaker, is their boss. And so if you've got a committee administrator on taxes or on education, that committee administrator is there always reporting back then to the speaker about what's going on in that committee. And then the speaker then sends their wishes out to that committee chair through that staff member. And it's kind of a monitoring thing and a kind of a control thing that isn't good for the idea of a member-driven caucus. And that's really what it needs to be. But since I've been here, at least the last 10 years for sure, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, well, it's really sad. And when I talk to people about how the committee chairs are chosen and how that controls which legislation comes forward, which legislation advances, which legislation even gets a hearing, right? Not all bills introduced get a hearing. That it really it's about the centralization of power. And I hope the listeners understand how this works now, and I hope this legisplating segment was helpful.
Or how it happens. May not work, but it happens.
That's right. Thank you so much, Draz.
Thank you.
This week, the House brought forward a bill, Senate File 192, which deals with the unemployment insurance for the state of Minnesota. Now, this fund is put together and it's managed by the state, but it's paid into by employers based on the number of unemployment claims that their business has. In other words, if your business lays off a lot of workers, you pay in a higher rate or a higher percentage of the wages you pay into this fund to make sure that the fund is solvent. Now, we had an issue in 2020 where the government came through and shut down businesses, told workers they were non-essential, and forced a lot of businesses to lay off their workers. It was a decision that a lot of employers did not make lightly. There were, in Minnesota, a lot of employers who did everything they could to keep their workers paid so that they would not lay them off because, one, it's the right thing to do, and two, they didn't want to have to pay higher rates into the unemployment fund. So Senate File 192, which passed the Senate last week unanimously, came to the House for a vote, and the House voted to suspend the constitutional requirement that a bill be heard 3 times on the House floor so that they could take this up immediately and pass it. There was only one lawmaker who stood up and questioned whether or not we needed to do this now, and that was me. I read the bill, and the way I read this bill is we're taking the 2019 unemployment numbers, so what percentage you lay off of your workers, and apply that to 2020. In other words, we're going to wash away all the unemployment that happened in 2020 and apply the 2019 numbers. Now, if you're an employer, let's say that you're in construction, and you laid off a lot of workers in 2019, but in 2020 you've been having a gangbuster year and haven't laid anybody off, you will be penalized because we're going to take your 2019 numbers and plug them into 2020. Also, if you're a bar owner or a restaurant owner and you did not lay off your workers in 2020, in fact, you didn't take a salary yourself, you didn't take any income, and you made major sacrifices to keep your employees employed, whereas other restaurants or other bars or other companies did not, you will be penalized because you will not be recognized for the sacrifices that you made in 2020. There are also businesses in 2020 who had significant layoffs. Major insurance corporations that went through a merger that laid off hundreds or thousands of workers in 2020. Everything will be swept under the rug. Even if those unemployment numbers from 2020 had nothing to do with COVID, we will ignore those. Now, what happens when $500 million is depleted from the unemployment insurance fund? All employers, regardless if they laid people off, will have to pay higher rates so that the fund can be replenished. And that is what is going to happen. Even though we're not going to look at the 2020 numbers of unemployment to assess which companies have to pay more, the result of this bill is that all employers will have to pay more in order to make that fund solvent again. And that is my question. That's why I stood up on the House floor and asked what the fiscal note is, what the revenue note is. And as it turns out, Representative Knorr, who's the author of the bill in the House, stood up and said there wasn't one. In fact, no revenue note and no fiscal note was even requested to be calculated to determine how much the rates are going to go up and who would be impacted. So the work wasn't done before this bill was rushed through the legislature. And I understand that we do suspend the rules to take up bills for an emergency from time to time. In fact, in the last year, we've done this very, very frequently. But for this specific bill, there was not an emergency that means we had to take up the bill. It was rushed through. Now, Representative Hamilton did say on the floor that there was no opposition to this bill. And that may be true. People maybe did not understand that all employers would have to pay more as a result of this bill going through. It's also important to note that the most powerful lobbyists in St. Paul right now are those representing industries impacted by COVID. So the hospitality industry, who is going to benefit from this bill, they certainly wouldn't have any objection. And it is important that the state step in and try to correct many of the wrongs where the governor has wronged businesses. But this bill, if you read through it, it has concerns. This bill wasn't ready for prime time, as they say. This bill it did not have carve-outs for specific industries. It didn't say only those impacted by COVID would not have to pay higher rates. This was a blanket bailout for all businesses who had unemployment in 2020 and did not take into consideration businesses that had higher unemployment rates in 2019 than in 2020, which may sound rare, but it does occur. My problem with this is that when government rewards bad behavior, we're going to get more of this in the future. We saw this with the bailouts that happened for the housing industry over a decade ago, where so many homeowners did everything they could to make sure they were paying their mortgage when we were in the last recession. And some people bought their house with no money down, and then as soon as they bought their house, went out and got a $40,000 home equity loan to buy a car, and then were underwater. And when the housing crisis went down, the government stepped forward and bailed out banks to allow them to sell these short sales for houses so that people could pay off. Basically, taxpayers were paying off people's cars and in home equity loans that they took out on their house but didn't use the money to go into the house. Again, we're rewarding bad behavior by not thoroughly vetting bills like this, and it was frustrating to see. In the end, I voted for the bill because there are a lot of businesses in Minnesota that had unemployment in 2020 that was unrelated to their actions. It was related to the governor's actions. But this bill was a blanket cover for all unemployment that happened in 2020. And this will require that all employers have to pay a higher rate of unemployment insurance to make this fund whole again. Now, there is one opportunity where the federal government can come through and bail out Minnesota. We're going to have to take out a loan to fund this. We take out a loan from the federal government. And more than a decade ago, when this happened last time, the federal government forgave that loan. But the federal government can't just forgive debt. The federal government must make all taxpayers pay for that debt. The federal government, although they can print money, it has to be paid by someone. And so this was a short-sighted approach to a solution and really kicks the can down the road. Legislators pretend that they can solve all problems, but this specific issue needed more vetting. The legislation should have been written in a way that was more narrowly focused to make companies whole who were damaged by the governor's executive orders, but not to reward bad behavior by some businesses who did use an opportunity of COVID to restructure their companies, go through mergers, or lay off workers that would then be swept under the rug. My arguments on the House floor were because we did not have a fiscal or revenue note to show how much more money was going to be collected and by which businesses. I felt like it was a really bad piece of legislation. It passed the Senate unanimously, and it did pass the House unanimously as well. If you spend 10 minutes discussing this bill with the public, my hope is that more of the public would be able to look at this bill and see that it was a taxpayer or a bailout funded by the businesses where some win and some will lose. And this is part of my frustration that government continues to pick winners and losers, even in the wake of this pandemic. For those listening, we're talking with Al Travis from Blue Earth, Minnesota. He's a radio personality and radio show host here in the Mankato area. We're on the air for a couple of years in Mankato.
Well, yeah, I guess it was 14, 15 months. I did my thing. It's I call it the cancel culture. I got kind of cancel cultured. And I've been in radio since 86, something like that. But I got out for a while, and I was doing a cable show all about politics. That's where I feed on this stuff. I get to talk to both the left and the right, and I enjoy the opportunity that Between the Lines, that's the name of the show on cable, that I get to do. Met guys like you. I mean, I meet the other side. Some of my best political friends, I'd use Senator Hoffman as an example. Left guy, he and I probably disagree on 90% of what we talk about. But on the other hand, he's very easy to talk to, and he likes a cigar. So I had him on the show, and afterwards we talked cigars, and we went out to a cigar place and had a cigar out in his district. And I just find him to be an enjoyable person. I have a real tough time on social media. If you disagree, we got to get rid of you. Because like I say, I do a program where I just beg these guys from the other side to come on, man. I find some are just completely delightful humans. They just vote wrong. I can live with that. So as an example, part of my company's business is I buy and sell advertising, ad agency, if you will. I find the best place to put your ads to get your point across. And Congressman Hagedorn, who wasn't a congressman at the time, had hired my company. So this is probably 10 years ago to buy his ads when he ran. Not a big deal. Didn't make a lot of money, but I did it every 2 years when he ran again until he won. And it's public knowledge, Federal Communications, Federal Elections Commission. You have to. I don't, but the campaign fills out all the forms. Every dime I've ever made is written there from his campaign, so I didn't think it was much of a secret. Radio station that hired me, KTOE, knew that I did that. I mean, we weren't hiding it from anybody. But some left-wing guy out of Washington, a group that, as I understand it, when I looked into them, they come from North Carolina. They call them progressive think tank. Pays 4 or 5 of these reporters, and I put my quotations up, to find out what's going on with the Republican Party. Now, I didn't make any difference to me. You get in politics, you got to put up with the game. I get it. I had no idea I could be caught up in it. Obviously, you look at the FEC filings and say, hey, Al Travis made money from Jim Hagedorn. There must be something wrong there. And he writes a story, and the local paper runs it for no other reason than to run it. It rips the radio station. It rips Hagedorn, and they lean left. I don't think that's a shocker. So I see why they run this story. But if you added it up, I don't know the number of if Al did or Al did this, could he have and would he have? And the if, woulds, and coulds in the story were amazing. But basically nothing happened. I never took any money from Hagedorn to be on radio, yada, yada. But the radio station pulled me off. They said just to make sure we look like, and I give them credit for it. They wanted to make sure the world knew that we weren't trying to be biased in any way. So they pulled me off until the FCC says, yeah, you're right, nothing happened. In the meantime, FCC asked us about 5 or 6 questions. I don't know how long's Al being on, yada, yada. And the idea that I worked for Hagedorn for 8 or 10 years before I ever got a radio job in Mankato kind of showed that he didn't hire me because I was on radio. I'd already had the gig for 10 years. There isn't a whole lot of there, but the idea that you can pull a guy off the air because you don't like the other team, they didn't know me. They didn't give a crap about Al Travis. It was because of Hagedorn running against the left guy. That to me is it's crazy. It's the number of people that get swept up in this stuff. I give you an example, and you're living it now. These businesses that have no say because of a coronavirus, no real living proof that anyone's getting it more or less because they're in a restaurant than someplace else. And somebody tries to open their business up and the government just slams them down. You're out. Well, it's just this idea that in America today, we can't be on a different side. And I get it. Other people say you're spreading the virus, we're all going to die. I get their fear, but to close them down, you can't be this or you can't be on the radio until we clear your name because you might be it's crazy out there right now. It is absolutely nuts. The only people that seem to be able to have a side are those that were actually elected. Everyone knows Representative Munson's on the right. Okay, he's allowed to do his thing and be his thing. The left can have their side, but if you're out there in the regular workaday world and you disagree with the governor, they'll put you out of business.
Yeah, and you said that it's surprising that they can pull you off the air because of this. I don't think it's surprising that they can pull you off the air to protect their radio station. What's surprising is that the liberal media can pressure KTOE to pull you off the air over, through an abundance of caution that that something may have been wrong, but that you've now proven there wasn't anything wrong.
Well, see, and thank you for clarifying that. You're right. I have no animosity for KTOE. They're doing what KTOE has to do because if the press keeps coming out, well, Al could have done this, he might have done that, he might have done this, it ruins this KTO's reputation. I have no problem that we're going to protect that over all other things. That's their business. I don't disrespect them in any way with that. It is exactly right that a paper would put a story out because it does 2 things. One rips KTOE, one rips the guy they don't like. They run a story from a guy, and it's interesting now, this great internet rate paper, Minnesota Reformer is the name of it, out of Washington. The guy who wrote the original story hasn't written a story since the election. They were there for one reason only. I mean, we're 3 months into, 2 months since the election, and what? No stories need to be written by this guy anymore. He's played his hand. He did what he's supposed to do. It's just wrong.
So there's some irony there that their accusation that you are somehow some media plant from the right paid to promote the right was written. The article was written by a plant from the left. hasn't written anything since, the election. That there's irony there. Now, for those listening, I mean, you didn't run some political talk show. This wasn't a inside politics. This was a afternoon drive time, 3 to 6 p.m. You're interviewing people about gerbils and nonprofits in the community and talking about, I mean, this is literally, it's nonstop, just what's in the community, talking to people locally. There was nothing, I mean, very little political, but you did have politicians on to give an update of what's happening on at the Capitals.
Well, I've had you on, Senator Frentz on, the congressman on here. And it's funny because I never would have broke it down. When we broke it down, because the FCC asked it to, you break it down, how many hours we're on politics, how many, it ended up out of the 30 hours a week I'm on the air, or 15 hours a week I was on the air, 12% of that had anything to do with politics. So out of all the things going on in the world, 12% were about politics.
And how much was about sports?
What's that?
How much was about sports? Probably more than 12%.
Oh, 35, 40%. And then, you bring up the gerbil thing. We did this bit with this gal who just said the best. She was going through pets, what make great family pets. It was a weekly bit we did. It was, she had as much time as the politicians did. We really weren't a political radio show. I mean, it was, politics were it, because guess what? We're going through a coronavirus and we had all this stuff going on at the state. You'd come on, and obviously we talk about what's going in the state, and you didn't like the Supreme Powers Act or whatever the governor's got. We talked about that. Our friends would come on and talk about his side. The congressman was only on, and that's the nice thing, he was on 8 times in a year. During a coronavirus, we actually did the numbers, and every conversation he had was about PPP. What is it? They closed down that plant in Worthington. Stuff that your congressman needs to tell you about, because that's what's going on. We weren't asking. There's no one on my show ever, even those on the left or yourself, that no one ever came to my show and asked anybody to vote for them. This is what's going on at the Capitol. It's what we should do as a radio station, and we sit pretty okay with what we've done. But the fact that, again, somebody can say, well, what if he did this, and if he took money under the table and he did the thing, it got goofy. And the fact that they do that is just nuts anymore.
Yeah, well, this is really important. I think you're probably not the only radio show host who has been put on ice because of the left going after and attacking, every chance they get to attack a Republican legislator. So I hope that KTOE brings you on soon, now that we're past the election and, the FEC did all their.
Yeah, I have no doubt it'll be sooner than later, but it's the question, and as a politician, you understand this. The reporter asked, have you stopped beating your wife yet? What's the answer to that? You can make that, yes, I'm done beating my wife. Okay, you're a wife beater. No, I'm not done beating my wife. You're a wife beater. To frame things and put headlines out that are of, how do I put this? No proof, no anything. It's what is, could have, and that. We have to get that stopped, because it can go to anybody. This guy's beating his dog. Let's see. If he was beating his dog, shouldn't he go to jail? Well, we talked to an expert for the ASPCA and says, yes, you should go to jail. And you make a whole story. The guy says, I don't even own a dog. There's no proof there. That kind of journalism has got to stop. And it'll stop when people say this is enough.
Well, I can tell you that a lot of farmers in my district loved driving around either tractors or in their vehicles, listening to your show. You were on AM, FM, you were broadcast all over the district. They love listening to the sports and all the updates in the community. So you're very missed.
I should share this quick story that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. So as a radio guy, when I first did radio, I literally had a guy call me, and he said, and he's a farmer, and I couldn't have been any more pleasant than Al, you're so great, you're this, that. I said, oh, well, great. When do you listen? He goes, I tune you on out at the cow barn because it makes them settle down. I don't know if that's a compliment or not. I put him to sleep.
That's great.
It's an honest story. The guy called up and told me how great I was for his radio, and it's like, where do you listen? In the cow barn, because it puts him down.
Shout out to Bessie today. Shout out to Bessie. Well, that's a good compliment. I mean, you'll take all the compliments from people. I think you were a great voice in the district, and people really enjoyed your show. And I'd urge KTOE to bring you back because you didn't do anything wrong and people were overreacting. And the Mankato Free Press, which is a very far left liberal paper, had an agenda, and they need to be called out for that.
We'll get back, but I got to be honest. Thank you for doing this podcast. I'm excited about it. The whole podcast thing, which is relatively new, and how does it work and make it happen? You're on the front end of this, and I love that. I hope this really takes off for you, Munson. I really do.
Well, thanks for being on the show, Al.
I appreciate it. It's been fun.
I'm a fairly active member of the Climate and Energy Policy and Finance Committee in the House. Energy is not my number one issue, but I have taken a deep interest in energy policy, especially when it comes to renewable energy. I traveled out to Nevada 3 years ago when I was on the Energy Committee, when it was under Republican control, to study alternative energy. I think it's really fascinating and exciting. There's a lot of really neat products that are being developed. I had an opportunity to go out and see what is referred to as the bird fryer. The bird fryer is called the Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating System. Now, this is about 5 square miles of federal land near the California-Nevada border, and there are 300,000 computer-controlled mirrors that are each the size of a garage door. They're 7 foot by 10 foot, and these sit atop these metal poles buried into the sand, and because it's the Bureau of Land Management land, they can't cement them in. And high winds that come through this area gently shift these mirrors back and forth, wiggling them so they turn a little bit, so they're off kilter and they're not correctly focused. All of these computer-controlled mirrors focus and track the sun and reflect the sun onto the top of this enormous tower. It's 459 feet tall. And because it reflects all the sunlight to the top of this tower, which has water in it, and it superheats the water and runs boilers off of steam. Now, it's a very cool design and a very cool idea. Extremely expensive. But as I said, the winds come through and shift these things so that they're off kilter and they have to constantly be readjusted and reset. Furthermore, because it's Bureau of Land Management land, you can't bury concrete and you can't bury wires. But there are wires running between every single one of these 300,000 mirrors, and they're laying on the ground. And because you're out in the desert, there are these endangered tortoises that are going around chewing on the cables and getting fried. So they have a whole team of environmentalists that have to go around and move these tortoises because they can't fence them out. It's BLM land. They have to move these tortoises to protect them. And in addition to that, a 5.5 square mile area of solid mirrors from high up in the sky looks like a lake. And so birds that are migrating over this area come down to settle in the lake and take a break and get some water. And as they come closer and closer to this enormous mass of mirrors, they get caught in this like tractor beam of super energy and actually start on fire in mid-flight. So the birds will be coming down to land on this what they think is a lake, and they'll start smoking. They call them streamers. And then the birds ignite into flames, come flying down, and smash into the mirrors, breaking the mirrors. This boondoggle kills like 60,000 birds a year are torched at this facility. It is, and when we were out there and we met with the director of this program, I asked the question, well, we're out in the desert. There's lots of winds and stuff. I see a lot of them are off kilter because of the winds. But do you also have a problem with dust on the mirrors? And he looks at me and goes, yes. We have, I don't know how many dozen semi-trailers full, tanker trucks that go to California to fill up with water and then come back where they have like squeegee squads that go around all day long, 7 days a week, to squeegee off all of these mirrors because the dust covers them and prevents them from being reflective. It is the biggest boondoggle. Now these things, I think they spent $1.6 billion that has been in guaranteed loans by the Department of Energy, and this facility finally filed bankruptcy. They're scrapping the entire project. But it is important to recognize the fact that this is a really cool idea on how to harness energy from the sun, but it only works when the sun is shining. When we were there, happened to be a cloudy day, which is rare in the desert, as a cloud blocks the sun, it immediately stopped producing energy. And then as soon as the sun shone again, you could see steam flying out from the top of the tower. So it is very intermittent, which means every time when you have things like solar or wind, well, primarily solar, when it stops producing energy, there is a blast furnace. So a very inefficient furnace that looks like a jet engine that fires up to produce energy somewhere in a natural gas-fired power plant. That must always be on the ready, 24 hours a day, ready to kick in case there's a cloud that goes overhead and blocks a lot of solar. So whatever carbon is saved by having a industrial solar array out in the cornfields must then be offset by a fully staffed natural gas blast-fired power plant that emits a large amount of carbon when you compare that to a super high efficiency 24-hour a day load-based natural gas power plant. So this is what we talk about on the Energy Committee. This is what we should be talking about this year, is how do you reduce carbon, and recognizing that when you have a solar array out there, it has to be matched with its carbon offset to produce load-based power. People in America are not willing to let the lights flicker every time the sun doesn't shine. And so we need to address this, and we have to have an honest conversation. Now, in the House Energy Committee this week and last, we've been discussing Representative Jamie Long, who's the chair of the committee, House File 278. This puts very bold goals for energy, and it says that we have to have 100% carbon-free power by 2040. That's 19 years from now. It's also important to recognize that in this bill, which is House File 278, if you go to house.mn and go to bill search and type in HF 278, you'll find the bill. On line 1.15, you'll see it says hydroelectric with a capacity of less than 100 megawatts is only what's considered eligible energy technology for renewable for hydro. Now, we have a bold initiative here to try to be renewable and carbon-free by 2040, but we're only looking at hydroelectric power with less than 100 megawatts because, God forbid, major investments in hydroelectric power, which is 24-hour a day, absolutely renewable, very little carbon. We're not going to consider large-scale hydroelectric. In fact, in Canada, they have a hydroelectric facility that is enormous and creates an enormous amount of renewable energy at almost 800 megawatts. So it would not be considered renewable under Minnesota's law. Also in this bill is it takes away the ability to burn trash for power. Now, we burn trash in Minnesota at many facilities. In fact, in St. Paul, when you fly into the airport, all the little waste receptacles there have trash to energy listed on the can. And to tell you a really interesting story, I was flying back from, I don't know where I was, somewhere on business or, I don't know, some trip. And I was sitting next to I was working on a presentation about green energy science deniers that I was going to give to students at Mankato State. And they saw pictures of slavery in the Congo, where children are mining cobalt for use in electric batteries. And they saw pictures of neodymium mining in Batao in China, in Mongolia, where it's created a 5.5 mile wide toxic lake, and the cancer rates are off the chart. And the neodymium is this rare earth magnet they use in the high-efficiency motors in wind turbines and electric cars. The amount of pollution that we're doing for mining green energy is incredible. And these minerals are very rare, so we don't have enough to make electric cars for everyone. But people have to understand the abhorrent labor conditions that we are subjecting people to in developing nations to mine, process, and manufacture green energy products. When we got to Minneapolis, the gentleman sitting next to me and his teenage daughter had said, you've really ruined it for me, Jeremy. I used to get in my electric car and hit the start button and feel like I was saving the world. But after seeing your presentation and learning about the supply chain of green energy, you've ruined it for me. You've ruined why I bought this electric car. And as we were at the baggage claim, the daughter went to throw away her Caribou coffee cup, and she saw the sign on this trash receptacle that said, trash to energy. And it looked all green. I think there's a leaf on it. And she said, look, Dad, they convert my cup into energy. And he looked over at me and I said, they burn it. And the look of disgust on her face was priceless. The realization that you can have renewable energy, but it isn't necessarily carbon-free, is a recognition that there is no carbon-free renewable energy. Everything has carbon in its supply chain. And this bill that Representative Long brought forward had an amendment from Representative Hornstein, which effectively ends the generation of energy from burning trash. Now, we called out in committee the fact that it wasn't actually ending the burning of trash. It's not illegal under this bill to burn trash. It's illegal to generate electricity while doing it, which is just crazy hypocrisy. Now, we incinerate trash because so much of the stuff that we throw away has energy that we can produce from burning it. And if we bury it, as it decomposes, it creates methane, which is a greenhouse gas 17 times more damaging than carbon. So we are effectively reducing greenhouse gas emissions by incinerating trash. And we don't just throw it in a pile and light a match. This isn't a burn barrel at an industrial scale. This is we inject air, make sure it's extremely high temperature. We recapture a lot of that energy when we're burning it to generate power. We're doing everything we can to reduce the carbon emissions, but we are doing this also to reduce not only methane gas, but we're reducing the amount of landfills that we have to have. Currently, there's a lot of trash that's trucked to Iowa and Wisconsin. Basically, the bill that as amended, it puts major changes in for how we dispose of trash and prevents us from generating electricity. Now, something else that came up in committee is that a large portion of the concrete that we install for highways is made up of fly ash, which comes from coal-fired power plants. So if you end coal-fired power plants in this bill, how are we going to construct our roads? Now, the other option, instead of using concrete, is we can use asphalt. But asphalt uses tar, and tar is a byproduct of refining oil into gasoline and natural gas and other things. So if we don't have a gas-fired power plant, if we end fossil fuel extraction for the purpose of energy, then we're not going to be able to build our roads out of anything unless we just put coal in a pile and light it on fire and then use the ash to build our roads that way. So we're going to have a lot of discussion about House File 278. I listed 8 amendments in committee that I had written, and instead of getting to my amendments, the committee chair ended debate on the bill and laid it over for possible inclusion in the committee's omnibus bill without even hearing my amendments. Now, we're in the minority, which means the only way that you can improve legislation is through amending it in committee or on the House floor. And I'll tell you, on the House floor, hardly anybody's paying attention. But in committee, people do want to have an honest debate and work to improve the bill. I had many amendments to improve the bill. For instance, banning slave labor at all to be used in products that we're subsidizing or mandating under this bill. I also have an amendment which will address the decommissioning of wind turbine blades. Currently, there's 1,100 blades sitting in a landfill in Wyoming, which is one of the last places you can actually bury these things. They used to make windmill blades out of fiberglass, which is recyclable. But to make them more flexible in high winds, they decided to make a composite of glass-reinforced plastic, which has a little bit longer life, but it is not recyclable. There is no useful byproduct. You can't melt down the glass without burning all the plastic. And so they're burying these blades, which are about 27,000 pounds of each blade. So just in the 1,100 blades that are sitting in that pile, that's almost 30 million pounds of plastic and fiberglass that are composited together with no useful byproduct. So my amendment actually says we can't ship these blades out of state. We must own that supply chain and dispose of them here unless the Department of Employment and Economic Development identifies a useful byproduct that's approved, and then they can ship it out of state for recycling. I also have a bill that targets the solar panels because of the recycling and decommissioning issues. We have all these solar farms that are put into rural Minnesota out in a cornfield. They are hugely subsidized by taxpayers. Developers are almost entirely from out of state because other states have stopped doing these solar development projects because they're kind of being taken advantage of. Minnesota still has them. We're attracting developers from all over the country. Mostly Florida, I think, is where most of them come from. And they're building them and walking away. They're not taking care of the dismantling and decommissioning of these solar panels. There was a tornado that came through California and caused the destruction of 200,000 panels. And once they're broken, you can't recycle them. In fact, recycling them now is very rare. They have such toxic chemicals in them, lead and cadmium. And so this bill requires solar developers to have a means and method for decommissioning and recycling these solar panels before they can install them. Another amendment that I have requires a nickel study. So obviously, we talked about how nickel is the number one ingredient in lithium-ion batteries. Actually, 65% of the weight of a battery is nickel. So if we're going to be mandating electric vehicles in the state and at the same time prohibiting Minnesota from mining nickel, I feel that's very hypocritical. And so this study is going to show which countries the nickel is coming from, or states or provinces, and comparing that to Minnesota's nickel mining, the amount of nickel that we've mined from Minnesota. So this is an annual report that would be required. This amendment was adopted. I also believe that the Public Utilities Commission should be taking into consideration this bill's impact to developing countries. There's a whole bunch of reasons in this bill on why the PUC would not need to enforce the 100% carbon-free mandate by 2040. And so they talk about environmental justice and the impact to a more minority population in Minnesota. I've added to that list the impact to developing countries. It says, the commission shall take all reasonable actions within its statutory authority and shall collaborate with the Commission of Labor and Industry and the Pollution Control Agency to ensure that this section is implemented in a manner that does not shift the negative environmental impact of carbon-free energy onto impoverished and developing countries, including but not limited to disclosing to the public the human rights abuses and labor conditions of workers, mining, manufacturing, and recycling, quote, carbon-free energy technologies and the materials of which they're composed. 2, disclosing to the public the environmental impacts of copper, lithium, cobalt, nickel, and neodymium mining. And 3, improving the traceability of mining supply chains used in carbon-free energy technology products. And then 4, documenting the effects of toxic pollution resulting from the decommissioning and recycling and disposal of carbon-free energy technologies. You see, I think it's so important that if they're going to pass a bill like this, that Democrats recognize that they are shifting the burden, they're shifting the destruction of the environment from power plants that are here into impoverished nations that don't have the environmental restrictions and the labor conditions that we have here in the United States. And if they're going to push this bill forward, they need to own the destruction of the environment that's caused by these carbon-free technologies. So hopefully the chair of the committee brings up a bill again so we can actually have a thorough debate on it and force roll call votes on all of these amendments in committee because this bill is a horrible bill for the environment. All it does is it shifts this burden to third world countries, and the people of Minnesota need to recognize that fact. Thank you so much for listening to this full episode of the Omnibus Podcast. In next week's episode, we'll be meeting with Jacob Quaid, who's an activist for shared parenting right here in Lake Crystal in my district, and talking with him about what shared parenting is, why you should care, and why you should be on the right side of this as we advocate for this important bipartisan change at the Capitol. We'll also be going through major legislation that's making its way through the House, including the elections bill, the elections omnibus bill, which makes some frightening changes that you should be aware of. We'll also be doing a deep dive into the governor's budget proposal and what the impacts are going to be for different state agencies and, of course, the taxpayers of Minnesota and how they're going to be impacted by this enormous tax increase that the governor is proposing. If you have ideas for segments that we should be doing on the podcast of legislation you'd like to hear more about, please email me at jeremy@jeremymunson.com. Offer your ideas on what we should be covering here on the podcast. Thank you so much for listening to the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane.